if I don't know if you all got my email or if you saw it this morning, if you're at all interested, I did send in the outline that you can print for when we watch the video a little bit later. Um, I thought it might be helpful just if you want to jot thoughts down as you're watching or something you're thinking about, um, that we can use to help when we're having our discussion a little bit after the video itself. Well, I'm going to get us started. There may be some others that will join us as well, but I think just for time's sake, I want to make sure we're leaving ourselves time to watch the video and have time to have a good conversation afterwards. I see some new names on here too, and I welcome them. And I'm Jenny Clark. I'm one of the pastors here at Westminster. And through this course, we will have different pastors, and then also Chris Clark, who's our director of youth and family ministries, will be leading the sessions over the course of the week. So this is our 4th week in what will be an 8-week series. We will take a break on Memorial Day. We won't have a class on that day, but this is sort of the halfway point. But what's going to happen, because it's actually a 10-session study. So up to this point, we've just gone through 1 session per week. Next week, Dawn will be leading it, and we'll actually squeeze in 2 sessions in that week, and there'll be another week coming down the road. I don't have it in front of me when we'll actually squeeze in 2 sessions in a given week as well. But this week, we will be doing the session called How to Study the History of Race. So if you have the book and we're able to read that during the week, that's helpful. But if you don't have a copy of the book, that's okay too. So we will be watching the video that talks about today, where Jamar Tisby, who's the leader of this study, will talk about how to study the history of race. And I hope you had opportunity after last week, where Ann led on discovering our racial identity, that maybe you got an opportunity to explore that a little bit for yourself and in your family, just looking back. But we're going to, as I said today, we're going to be talking about how to study the history of race. And just some little facts about how we do this. It's helpful if you will mute yourself during watching the video, especially just so we're not hearing background noises behind you. If you have somebody knocking at the door, your phone ringing, or the dog barking, or anything like that, it's helpful not to have the sound, or it's helpful to have your sound muted. But when we get to times where we want to talk, certainly unmute yourself. And it's also helpful if you want to join in the conversation, to let us know by raising your hand. If you're able to, there is at the bottom of your Zoom bar at the bottom, there should be one that says, a button that says reactions, and there's where you can raise your hand. There's all kinds of little things that you can do, but you want to raise your hand, you hit that, and then you see me up in the corner, my hand's raised. That helps, that kind of bumps your square up to the top corner for me too. That will help me to see that you wanted to speak, and I can call on you. If that isn't work, then when you're done with it, you kind of go back to that same bar, and then there's a button to lower your hand. If you're not able to make that work and you raise your hand like that, I'm going to try to look for you, but just an FYI, my eyes sometimes don't pick up somebody because you're all over the screen for me. So if you're able to make that, push that raise your hand function, that works well as well. So welcome everybody, and let me open us with prayer. We give you thanks, O Lord, for this new day and this opportunity to gather with friends as we continue to study how to fight racism and to learn more from Jamar in our work that we have to do and want to do. So bless our time, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So just to kind of get us into the subject today, I want to throw out a question to you. and if you had an opportunity to read the chapter, Jamar talks about different resources that are out there to help us study race. And I'm just curious if any of you have any resources that you have used in your study of the history of race, of what you've watched or read or what's been helpful. If you'd like to share that with the group as we're getting into this.
I can share. Mm-hmm. Two books that I've found very helpful. One is The Christian Imagination by Willie James Jennings. I believe he's a professor at Yale, but African-American professor, and he talks a lot. He talks about how, you know, whiteness started and how it really entered into our Christian imagination early on in like the 1400s, and how he connects that to colonialism and land and identity and all that. So that was really good. And then the other one was The Color of Law, learning about redlining in our country. It was something I wasn't really, I saw the effects but didn't understand what had happened to help make our communities that way.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else have any resource? Kathy, did you raise your hand?
Trying to find my unmute button. Yeah, I have several books that have helped me just understand our you know, systemic racism problem in the country, like White Fragility and Wait Too Long. And there's one by Eddie Glaude Jr., Begin Again, that gave me a different perspective. I'm not finished that one yet. And then I have one that's a children's book that I just received called All Different Now. It's about Juneteenth, and it's beautifully illustrated. And like so many children's books, it's not just for children. It's so beautiful. I just wish I had some children to read it to. I would, yeah, it's good. It's all about the celebration of Juneteenth and what it meant for them back in 1865.
Well, thank you, Kathy. Nice to know about that. I see Sue Kelly's hand up.
Hi, yes. One book I'm reading with a small group is Be the Bridge. And it's very much, for me, an internal journey, although it includes history. It also emphasizes the life of the author. So it's almost like talking with a diverse group. And it's very, very helpful in terms of looking within to see, you know, where we are. I think last week we talked about how sometimes it's good to turn around and nod at our old self and then work on our new self or white identity. So it's been helpful.
Good, good. Anybody else? Paul, do you have your hand up?
Yeah,
Paul.
yeah. We, as part of another study group, we were referred to 400 Souls, a community history of African America, 1619 to 2019. And it's a collection of individual essays, including Jamarch's, if he has one in there. Oh. And we're not very far into it, but it's really, it seems it's kind of very interesting reading.
Okay, thank you. Nick.
Three things I would recommend. First one is Ralph Ellison wrote a book called The Invisible Man, and he talks about being a Black man and being invisible in white society, and people knowing that Blacks exist, but not knowing their history and the depth of slavery. And it's a very impactful book, and I recommend it highly. The second one is the autobiography of Malcolm X. It's an excellent book, and he also talks about, of course, the Nation of Islam and his struggles to find his place in society. And the third would be the James Baldwin books, and understanding the depth of anger that Blacks have about how they've been treated over the years. Those three sources I recommend.
Thank you. Thank you. Don, you have your hand up.
Sorry, it's hard for me to reach all the buttons. This is a book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Edward Baptist is the author. And it's been one of the most helpful things for me in understanding how the structure of this nation's economy was built on slavery, and informs me in terms of some of what Jamar's talking about in terms of how or why would we even think about something like reparations. And the book is brutal, but it has lots of personal accounts of slaves, former slaves, of what their lives were like. Very powerful book.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sue Kelly's hand still raised. Are you having more to say, Sue, or did you just forget to put your hand down? Oh, it's down. Just a documentary I highly recommend is 13th by Ava Duvernay. If you have not seen that yet, I believe you can see it on Netflix. Powerful, powerful documentary. It talks about, with the 13th Amendment, we ended slavery, but how slavery really didn't end, with how it's morphed into laws that got put in place that kept Black people enslaved in the prison system. And very eye-opening and very helpful for me in understanding history of that and kind of where we are today. So I highly recommend that to you. I don't want to take up too much more time now, so I'm going to take us to the video today with Jamar. So I'm going to share my screen.
In his piercingly insightful essay, Unnameable Objects, Unspeakable Crimes, James Baldwin reflects on the importance of history. He says, "For history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. History is alive." In this section, I want to focus on how to study the history of race. I'll be honest, I'm a student of history, and so I'm really excited about this topic and how it helps us move forward in this journey toward racial justice. Why should we study history? Put simply, history is context. In order to effectively fight racism, we have to know how the past influences the present. Historians are quick to say history does not, in fact, repeat itself. There are too many contexts and contingencies. Every era of history is its own peculiar and distinct entity, so to speak. But history does rhyme. We can hear the music and the cadences and the syncopations of the past in the present. And history is important not just for white people, but also for Black people and other people of color to understand. You see, as racial and ethnic minorities, we may have personal experiences with racism and white supremacy, and we can speak out of that knowledge, and our personal experience is important, but that's not the only kind of knowledge we need. We need to study our own history, our own past, and the history of this nation in order to effectively fight racism. So studying history is for everyone. Our first essential understanding in how to study history is realizing why history is important, why we should study it in the first place. In a word, history is context. I remember when I was in seminary, we put a lot of work into understanding the context. We wanted to understand the original languages, who the original authors were, what the original audience was, what the problems they were addressing, all of this, why? So as the Bible said, we could rightly divide the word of truth. In a similar fashion, history is context for our culture and for current events. If we want to understand what's happening in the world around us, then we have to understand what happened before, what led us to this point. That's how I got into the academic study of history. In 2014, an 18-year-old Black teenager named Mike Brown was shot and killed by a white police officer, and the small community of Ferguson, Missouri entered the national conversation. Like many people in this country, I was trying to figure out what exactly was going on and how to make sense of the situation. I found that it was often historians who had the most helpful things to say. They were able to talk about redlining and racial restrictive covenants. They were able to talk about the origins of the police force and their connection to the policing and control of Black bodies historically. I wanted access to this knowledge. It seemed like this secret history, the secret information that helped unlock the present. So studying history actually helped me understand not just the past, but the present as well. But there's one more reason I think we should study history too, and it's deeply personal. History is about identity. History is about learning the stories of the people who came before us, how those stories actually shape who we are. So there's a very real sense in which not knowing our history means not knowing ourselves, but learning history means learning more about ourselves and who we are, so that we can further progress down this journey toward racial justice and more effectively fight racism. Another essential understanding in how to study history in order to fight racism is the principle of Advantas. That's a Latin phrase that means back to the sources. And it was a rallying cry during the Protestant Reformation in the 15th and 16th century. In that case, it meant going back to the original sources for the Bible, looking at the Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic, translating the Bible, and going back to those primary documents to help people understand their faith and their Christian tradition. I think that principle, Advantas, can also be applied to studying the history of race. And what I mean by that is go back to the primary sources. That is the documents, the artifacts that the historical actors themselves produced. By going back to the primary sources, we can untangle some of the misunderstandings in the present that we have of the past. For instance, a Pew Research survey from 2011 said that 150 years after the Civil War began, 48% of respondents thought that the Civil War was about, quote, states' rights, compared to 38% who thought it was about slavery. So we have a minority of people who believe that the Civil War was indeed fought on the basis of slavery. But this principle of Advantas, or going back to the primary sources, helps us untangle this. And we can see the true causes of the Civil War as articulated by the historical actors themselves. So if you look at the Articles of Secession for several states, these are the documents that outline the reasons why Confederate states chose to break from the Union and form the Confederacy. The first state to do so was South Carolina, and what they wrote in their Articles of Secession point explicitly to slavery as a cause. It says, but an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slave holding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations. And the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from her obligations. Clearly connected to slavery. Also, we can look at Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. In his famous Cornerstone speech in 1861, he said that the Confederacy's cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. So, for anyone who says that the Civil War was not fought on the basis of slavery, all you need to do is go back to the sources, look back at the primary documents, and you will see that the people present and living at that time understood it to be on the basis of slavery and helped to untangle modern day misunderstandings. So there are several helpful practices when it comes to studying the history of race. I want to highlight just a few. First of all, how do you spot trustworthy resources? How do you know that what you're reading or hearing about is actually verifiable and fact-based and fact-checked? First of all, we need to disabuse ourselves of the idea that any scholarship, any history, any sort of academic study of the past is purely objective. It's just not possible. There's a historian named Kevin Gannon who wrote about the myth of objectivity in scholarship, and particularly in historical research. And he said this: "But the idea of an objective version of history telling from which all others are deviant is an absurdity. There is no objectivity in history. The very act of selecting a topic, for example, is privileging certain facts, making them historical over others." And so he's saying that in simply choosing a topic to address and selecting what information you want to include and exclude, all of that involves subjective opinions. But this, on its face, does not disqualify a source as trustworthy or not. We just have to recognize that every treatment of history is going to have some degree of subjectivity and filtering through someone's personal lens. And that's okay. What we want to do to spot a trustworthy historical resource is a couple of things. Number one, as I mentioned before, go back to the primary sources. If you want to fact check something, you can. Information has never been more accessible. I remember researching this juicy quote for a piece of writing, and I wanted to make sure that it was verifiable because it was just that good. I didn't want to risk anyone discrediting it. So I saw it first in a news article. I tracked that quote to a book. That book referenced an audio tape. Thankfully, that audio tape had been digitized, and so I could listen to it online. And so this was an interview with the person who actually said the quote, a primary source. And so I was able to verify it by tracking it down, going back to the sources, and including that juicy quote. It was about politics. I won't get into it now. Another way to spot a trustworthy historical resource is to be aware of a Whig interpretation of history. Whig, W-H-I-G, meaning after the old-fashioned political party. A Whiggish interpretation of history is a history of almost inevitable progress. It talks about the human narrative, the human story as proceeding almost unimpeded toward greater equality, greater awareness, greater democracy, all of these things. A Whiggish interpretation of history is often told by the victors for the victors. It is a story of exceptionalism. I think this is really important as we look at the history of race in the United States. It can often be tempting to tell a history that is triumphant, that shows America as this great democratic experiment that, for all its many failings, has failed forward by and large. Well, this is difficult to accept when you study the primary source documents and academic histories, because you know all of the interruptions, the missteps, the stumbles, the falls, and the perspectives of the marginalized and oppressed that get left out of this Whiggish interpretation of history. So be very careful if that particular slant is always upward and always toward a brighter day. Another racial justice practice we need to employ is the idea of taking down Confederate monuments and symbols. This is a very fraught prospect for a lot of people, causes a lot of controversy, but it's really important because symbols matter. In 2017, the last of 4 major Confederate monuments came down in the city of New Orleans. Now, activists had been pushing to remove these monuments for decades, but in 2015, Mayor Mitch Landrieu, he added his voice and his weight and his position to the call. Then in 2017, when those monuments came down, he gave a speech and he articulated the importance of taking down these monuments. He said, "These monuments purposefully celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, and the terror that it actually stood for." Mayor Landrieu and so many others recognize that these monuments to the Confederacy, which stood for slavery, are oppressive reminders of white supremacy and of the fact that a certain segment of society would prefer that Black people and other people of color remain subordinate. So we need to take them down. But what about the objections you'll face? Some people say that taking down Confederate monuments and statues is akin to erasing history. Listen, I'm a student of history. I love reading about history, learning about history, exploring the past. I'm the last person who wants to see history erased or diminished in any way. But there is a big difference between veneration and remembrance. We can remember the past without venerating people who thought it was okay to own human beings. We can remember the past in a lot of different ways besides erecting a statue or putting up a flag. There are museums, there are documentaries, there are plenty of online resources, there are textbooks and academic books by historians that tell the history of race. Believe me, we're not going to lose the story. We actually might remember a better story. What about those who object that, in particular, talking about the Confederacy, it's about, quote, heritage, not hate? Well, I talked before about some of those primary source documents defending slavery. And so there's a very real sense in which the heritage of the Confederacy is hate. It is hate toward people made in the image and likeness of God, a hate that manifested itself in race-based chattel slavery, later Jim Crow segregation, and even into the present day, a racialized society where so many quality of life factors from health to wealth to education all fall predictably along racial lines. So I ask, is that the heritage you want to celebrate? Even just looking at the South, look at all there is to commemorate and that we could celebrate, from the music to the history to the activists who fought for racial equity and justice. Where are the monuments to them? Where are the remembrances of them? Another racial justice practice I've been talking about for years is commemorating Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a portmanteau made up of the words June and 19. It's a commemoration of the day in June 1865 when enslaved Black people finally learned that the Civil War had been won, that emancipation was on the horizon, and it stands as the oldest celebration of Black emancipation in the country. I think we should all commemorate Juneteenth. First of all, it forces us to look backwards and see where we've been, particularly to reckon with the fact that this nation's wealth was built upon the enslavement of people of African descent. It'll force us to revisit the history of the, quote, peculiar institution, meaning race-based chattel slavery, to understand its horrors, to reflect and lament. But commemorating Juneteenth does something else, gives us cause to celebrate. Listen, we're not where we need to be, but we are also not where we were. I'm glad the physical chains of slavery were loosed, yes, through the nation's bloodiest war, the Civil War, but emancipation became a reality. Abolition became the norm. That's something to celebrate. It's a milestone in this nation's history. But of course, a third reason to commemorate Juneteenth is that it reminds us how far we still have left to go. So yes, we fought a civil war, enslaved Africans were freed, but they exchanged the shackles of slavery for the metaphorical shackles of poverty, of Jim Crow, of segregation, and for continued discrimination. And so commemorating Juneteenth would allow us to look ahead, to plan for the future, and ask ourselves, what more must we do? Other important racial justice practices as they pertain to history include learning from academic historians and reading books by university presses, doing a local history of the community around you and seeing what is the past and the history of the place where you live or reside. Or it may involve doing an oral history of people you know or people who were significantly involved in momentous events in racial justice history. William Faulkner famously wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." History provides the context for unlocking the present. If we want to know how to effectively fight racism, we have to know how we got here. And that's why we study the past.
All right. So let me throw out there, what stood out to you from Jamar's teaching, either in the video or maybe something that you picked up in the book? What stood out for you? Is there anything that?
I see Marjorie had her hand up.
Okay, we'll go with Marjorie and then we'll go to the Schwartzes.
Very quickly, I think the lack of history that we live with is really shocking. And I think that got mentioned before, the 1619 Project on the New York Times has been an amazing revisionist history, and it's hard to read. But I think that we think we understand the history of racism, and we don't.
Definitely, thank you. We'll go to Carol or Dennis. I'm not sure which one has the hand up.
I was going to say, certainly his emphasis on primary sources. Just hearing what I've forgotten the name already, but the vice president of the Confederacy had to say about the reasons for the Civil War. It's mind-numbing.
Mm-hmm. And just the Pew survey that found in when was that? That like 38% believed it was over, the Civil War was fought over slavery, and 48, that was surprising too, how people had thought it was states' rights, not. Kathy.
It is states' rights. It's states' rights to own slaves.
Kathy.
Oh yeah, thank you. What I wanted to say is that what stood out to me was them taking down monuments. That just hits close to home from where I was born in Easton, Maryland. They still have a monument right out front of the courthouse to the Talbot boys, which were 6 young men who fought in the Confederacy. And it's right there in the middle of town. And it's a huge controversy among the citizens of the county, Talbot County. And many want to take it down, but then many others say it's our history, it's our heritage. And so, they have not decided yet what to do with it. And it's interesting. I asked my stepmother, like, what are they doing with those Talbot boys? And she said, oh, they're still fighting over it. So that was interesting to me. Yeah. And also there's something about the on page 74, if you have the book, the National Statuary Hall collection. Every state has 2 statues that they donate, and he mentions to look up who your state celebrates in this statuary hall. And I looked up, I found Robert Fulton as one of them. So thank goodness, he wasn't promoting slavery, but I don't know who the other one was.
Yeah. Thank you. And looking around our own communities, are there street names or parks named after people? Who were they? What did they stand for? So I think that would be interesting to explore too. Was there another hand? Oh, Judy Eberhardt.
Just another comment as far as what Kathy was saying. I so appreciate it when he takes on and is willing to say, when somebody says this, how about this as far as your response goes? Because we hear all these explanations and reasonings and rationalizations. And I wrote down with big stars beside it, there's a big difference between remembering and veneration. And I thought that was so wise and something that really could be explored. And the other piece was to explore our own local history. I have no idea about the local history, or, Chester County's history as far as racism goes. And I think that would be interesting too. But I like it when he takes on the yes, but arguments and gives such a thoughtful response to them.
That's right. Thank you. I think Bob Bell, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, it's timely. It was just in the past day or two that the city of Philadelphia has established a monument and marker commission to review in the city some of these issues of what is appropriate and what isn't. So that's timely.
That is timely. And Maryland, Larry Hogan, the governor, yesterday I saw in the news last night that he has, like, they want to take all the people who were lynched in Maryland and give them like reprieves, that they are not considered criminals, and to pardon them. So that was just last night I heard that, which I think he's the first governor to do something like that. I see either Jean or Katie's hand up.
And talking about taking statues down or putting them up, my memory is that somewhere in Eastern Shore of Maryland, where Harriet Tubman grew up, that they've erected a statue to her.
Yeah, I think my husband serves in Newcastle Presbytery, which goes down that direction, and I believe that, like, you can go to her house, and that there's a whole thing, that they've really lifted her up and wanting to preserve her historical significance in this fight. I don't see, is there anybody's, okay, Nick.
Nick.
We'll go to Nick and then Kathy.
Just talking about local history, I found this to be fascinating. St. Thomas the Apostle Roman Catholic Church was actually started in a family's home here in Pennsylvania, and they would have a priest that rode by horseback from Philadelphia to do Sunday services in their home. Well, it turned out these folks had a stable of horses, and they dug out underneath the stable and became part of the Underground Railroad. And they hid blacks on their way to Canada so that they could have freedom. And then later on, the church moved out of their home and became a built church. It's been rebuilt again. But it's interesting that a local family here in Pennsylvania was part of an Underground Railroad and did it at great risk.
Yes. Kathy.
I just wanted to say again about Harriet Tubman. She was from Dorchester County down in Eastern Shore of Maryland. And there's a museum there now, and they found her childhood home, and they have a book traveling the Underground Railroad by car. So they have like places listed that you can start down there and go to the different landmarks that she stopped on the Underground Railroad and ending in Philadelphia, I think.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It is interesting. And I don't know if any of you who are on this, back before the pandemic, Gordon McCoskey from Princeton Seminary came in and did a class, a 3-week class for us, talking about the Princeton Seminary's slavery audit that they did and kind of the research and he kind of encouraged us to do research in our area. And he brought up there was a lynching in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which many of us never knew. And so that was the last lynching in Pennsylvania. I guess after that one, there weren't any more. But, you know, Franklin Roosevelt weighed in on that, and he encouraged, like, look, like, what did your church have to say about it? You know, and we haven't found any records on that, but I did find my great-grandfather, so it would be Chris's great-great-grandfather. He wrote poems, and he'd submit them to the newspaper. It was called the Coatesville Record. And so this lynching occurred on August 13th, 1911. They burned this man, Zachariah Walker, and threw him in the fire. He escaped from it twice, and they kept throwing him back in. And it was horrible. And my great-grandfather, Chris's great-great-grandfather, I found one of his poems that had been published 2 days later in the Coatesville Record about the mob. And, you know, he really spoke against what they had done. And so it is interesting when you start exploring what will you find. And in our own, I had no idea that this far north that there were lynchings. So there's pieces of history that we just don't know. But if you Google the Coatesville lynching, you'll find, you know, the story of it, and pretty awful piece of history locally for us.
Jenny?
Yes.
Jenny, this is Carolyn Ginther.
Oh, hi, Carolyn.
I've had occasion to spend some time in the Chester County Archives, and they have an enormous collection of all kinds of wonderful documents. One of the things I would suggest, if the group is interested, is that you might make arrangements to invite the archivist to come and address the group, you know, for anybody who's interested, to share some of the local history with us, okay? Because it's quite interesting, and it's very revealing, because there were both people who were active in the Underground Railroad in Chester County, but there were also throughout southern Pennsylvania those people who held slaves. And the Historical Society of Pennsylvania down in town, Pennsylvania Historical Society, recently posted a copy of a petition that they have in their archives that dates from 1862 that shows the people of color in Philadelphia petitioning to be allowed to ride the streetcars. Okay, so, and the other statement that they made with that petition is that Philadelphia was the most segregated northern city during the Civil War. So there's a lot of very revealing history. And I happened to recently come across a document that shows that Arlington Cemetery in Upper Darby, which happened to have been the farm owned by Judge Garrett. And Judge Garrett, if you have heard of Garrett Road, Judge Garrett actually was very active in the Underground Railroad, and they have preserved his home on the grounds of the cemetery. And there are historical markers there. It's a public cemetery, so you can go in there and read that. And he was also working in concert with William Still, who was a Black man, a free Black man, who was active in Philadelphia and the Delaware, Maryland area with the Underground Railroad. There's tons of information, and it's primary source material, okay? So we need to talk to some of these people who are familiar with it, who work with it, and I'm sure would be happy to share it with us.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. I want to throw out another question. So according to Jamar, why is it important to understand history when it comes to fighting racial injustice? What's the importance of us knowing this history in this fight for racial injustice, against racial injustice. Or do you think it, I mean, what significance does it have for you?
Well, I think Chris alluded earlier to the fact that, it's important to understand the principles of redlining, because redlining was a fairly recent development and it was very prevalent in the whole region. Okay, the banks did not hesitate to practice redlining when it came to issuing mortgages. And so the realtors kind of went along with it if they wanted to sell houses. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, we need to understand that.
Yeah. I see the Schwartz.
Yeah, I would say basically echoing what he says, you don't know where you are unless you know how you got there.
Right. And I see Sue Kelly's hand up.
Yes, hi. The statement that, the past is today really resonated with me. In another study, we read the sermons from Martin Luther King, who was, a huge leader within my lifetime. And the exact same sermons could be given today. That was the past, but this is today. And it's the past is today in that instance. And with much of the culturalization or the information we've rather absorbed like sponges without even knowing it. So examining the past is crucial, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Andy?
So one thing that's been bothering me for a while, I saw a person write a reaction to why we shouldn't be teaching, I guess, a more multicultural versions of history. And his argument was that, he, like most Americans, came from working class people who did not have power, emigrated to the United States after the Civil War, and are therefore not culpable for slavery and the racial injustices that have happened in American history. And statistically speaking, that is true. The vast majority of white Americans are probably descended from people who came during the Industrial Revolution, from working class people who came after the Civil War. Yet it's not something you can exactly turn your back on. So I guess what Jamar is saying is it's kind of a double-edged sword, and I'm a little hesitant to just kind of throw that out there, that some people are going to say, well, hey, this just, I don't have any responsibility for this. My ancestors didn't do this. My ancestors were poor and exploited too, which to some extent was true. I don't know. I'd like to know what other people think, because I don't know how to respond when somebody says something like that.
Chris, do you have a response?
Yeah, I actually heard someone talking about this recently. There's an Irish man named Padraig Ó Tuama who person of faith. I think he's Catholic. He helped create the Corrymeela community in Ireland that was to help begin reconciliation and healing after the Troubles in that country. And he was on a podcast sharing about the complicated history that he's kind of reckoned with a little bit of his people, where, a lot of his country in Ireland has a history of colonialism under the British Empire. And so there's a lot of stuff that comes with that. And, especially with, Northern Ireland and north and southern part of Ireland. And he said, the complication is, people left there to come to the United States, partly because of persecution or how hard it was. But he said, coming to America, what he learned was a lot of those same people then got right on board with the way that, Black people were treated in the United States. So he said there's a complication there. It makes it very complex and tricky because people were coming from a place like Ireland for, certain freedoms or to be free from injustice or whatever wrongs were done to them. And then when they came here, this kind of like, they also helped to perpetuate wrongs that were going on already here in the United States toward Black and brown people. So it is a complication, and I don't have an easy answer for that, but it certainly, it kind of opened my understanding of, how to reckon with your history a little bit. Yeah.
I see Don's hand up.
I was just going to say that the book I shared about the foundations of the American economy in slavery, the people, Andrew, that you're talking about, and some parts of my family came over late. Most of mine are pre-revolution, but anybody who came to this land of opportunity was benefiting from the economy that was built on the backs of slaves. So we're going here, some people to escape persecution or injustice or others, but a lot of people came because the opportunity was here. The opportunity was here. Slaves weren't being paid anything. And the infrastructure that established the strength of this nation's economy benefited from the fact that there were no payroll costs for the workers. I mean, that's the biggest portion of the budget of any organization that's got employees, but there were no payroll costs. So I tell folks, your family didn't come over till after the Civil War, but you benefited from an economy that had, you think of the foundation of the house, the entire foundation of this nation's capitalism and its strength came from slavery. So that's one of my responses.
Yeah, I see Nick's hand up.
I just wanted to give you a living example of the depth of economic prejudice that went on in the New York banking system. Between 1970, this is 1970 and 71, I had a job at Bankers Trust Company in New York in the Southeast Bronx. And we were told not to give Black people or Hispanics loans, but instead to put them on credit cards. And the reason was the credit card interest rate was 3 times what the going loan rate was. So in 1970 and 71, we were being instructed to put Black people and Hispanics on credit cards so they would pay a much bigger interest rate than if they were just getting a loan. And this was in the Southeast Bronx that was heavily Black and Hispanic.
Thank you for sharing that. Schwartz, as I see your hand up.
Yep. I don't think it's so much a question of trying to get back to say you're responsible for slavery. And that may be where the argument they're trying to say, well, I didn't do that. But you're responsible for the world you live in right now. And if you take some time to look at how you got there, I grew up, and I didn't say I had any special thing. We weren't rich or anything else. And I have a brother who would say that we weren't privileged and we're not part of the white. We sort of don't talk politics in the family. But if you look at all the advantages we've had, and I see Don shaking his head, he knows Ohio a little bit. I cannot deny that I had things given to me due to the fact I'm white. If not denied, maybe that's the other way of putting it. And therefore, I have a responsibility for the world I live in. I don't care how you got here. You need to know how you got here because you need to know how to fix it then going forward. So if you don't believe in the democracy of equal chance for all and try to make it so that it can be that way, then you're participating in perpetuating the old system.
Thank you. Sue Kelly.
Yeah, I was relating to what Andrew had mentioned. we know, and family members, friends, neighbors will have a totally different take on, the effects of white supremacy and whether or not they actually should be held culpable. I believe that, as the body of Christ, the church can reach out to individual by individual, and there's an opportunity to hear that person disagree, ask them more deeply about their family, get to know them perhaps a little better, and at some point either share your opinion or ask them to reverse the story and what their family would have endured if they had not been white. There's a lot of one-to-one opportunities that we have as the body of Christ. So what the outcome may be for that one person to either understand or not at that point in time, God knows, but it's an opportunity. So thanks for bringing it up, Andrew. I identify with that one.
Kathy.
I just want to say that if you keep reading further in the book, when we get to chapter 6, he does have a section on how to talk to, what does he call it? Racial justice resistors and people that have the arguments that you mentioned, Andrew. And he gives some good comebacks. So that's really helpful. We'll get there.
Well, and thanks for mentioning that. So next week, if you are reading the book, read chapter 5 and chapter 6. So that chapter will be included in next week's session. So thinking about all the different practices that he kind of laid out of ways that we can study, are there any in particular that you've participated in trying to do that work? If it's the monuments or Juneteenth or talking to first person historical, hearing their stories, or what things have you done or do you want to do that you're interested? It was interesting. We were down in New Orleans about 3 weeks ago visiting our daughter and son-in-law and our grandsons, and that he mentioned, how Mitch Landrieu was the mayor who finally got them to get these Confederate monuments down. But while we were driving around, we were driving on Robert E. Lee Boulevard, which is a major road. And we asked Ashley, like, are they planning to take that, name away? And she said, yeah, it's all, I think it's already been done, but part of it, I think, is just getting signs changed and, all of that. But, there's a place that's working on it, but as you said, Kathy, Maryland, where you're from, there's still lots of work that needs to be done. Paul.
I thought it was amazing that at St. Vincent College, we hardly celebrate Martin Luther King Day. They might have a speaker. They do have classes. And I brought up, it wasn't very popular for bringing this up, is why would we close the campus so we could have a funeral service for Arnold Palmer, but we won't celebrate Martin Luther King?
What was the response?
I didn't understand how important Arnold Palmer was to the community of Latrobe and St. Vincent.
Okay. I'll see Sue Kelly and I'll go to Nick.
I would be interested in during Black History Month to reach out to our community, the Black community and other churches, to help them continue the celebrations that they have and become part of, hopefully part in an extension of that, I tend to shift away from, with my I forget what the word is, but with my mindset as a white woman of 70, having had 70 years of unrecognized privilege, I would love to go out of the smaller church community of Westminster and get into the communities of our other Presbyterian brothers and sisters for, as I said, African American celebration, but then also to celebrate Juneteenth. That was the best thing that could happen for our for white people as well, to come back to what Jesus wants us to do and live. So those are the two things that come to mind.
Okay, thank you. Nick.
Two things that contributed to my racial awakening was I was in a special program at Yale and I had two Black roommates. And one was from Meridian, Mississippi, and the other one was from Birmingham, Alabama. So I got to hear their firsthand accounts and their feelings about how racial injustice affected their lives and their whole families. I got to hear how they felt white people looked at them. The biggest lesson I learned was how smart they were. That Black people were to be really, really smart. That's why they were at Yale. And it also, they were very good at science and math, and also in the liberal arts. So, seeing it firsthand and seeing that Black people were really smart, not stupid, certainly helped to open my eyes. And the other thing was, I once lived with a Black family for a weekend and just lived with them. And again, heard their stories and saw their culture up close, ate their foods. Those things will really open your eyes.
Mm-hmm. So that's going to lead us into the next. So we've been doing the awareness of this arc. So the next 3 chapters of the book, we'll be talking about those relationships that are so important. Chris, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think I can't recall if he touched on this in the video, but in the book, he touches briefly on the history of Native and Indigenous people in the U.S. and how you can learn more. And, I know we are on Lenape land or Delaware Indian land. And I know very little about, in terms of the treaties and stuff that were rendered. So I would be curious to learn more on that end too, of our racial past and in terms of our land too, of, where do we live on and is there any history there that we're not aware of other than, hey, we made a treaty in it, and as far as history is told, it went pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Don.
Chris just mentioned the local tribe, and I was at a learning from some indigenous peoples in Minnesota, and I went up to talk to the guy who was presenting afterwards, and I said, yes, I live off of Lenape Road, and he said, oh, you mean Lenape? And I learned, oh, I'm even mispronouncing the name of the tribe, and I've lived here for probably 17 or 18 years by that point in time, and everybody calls it Lenape. And I learned something new. Again, it's one of those things where we don't know sometimes what we don't know.
That's right. Well, thank you for telling us, because I grew up in this area, went to Lenape Park. So I've always thought it was a Lenape tribe. So thank you. Sue Kelly.
Yeah, I really appreciate Chris bringing up our original indigenous people here. We so often refer to, well, this was the British settlement and erase all history prior to the white man coming. There's so many posts and there's information online where the indigenous people would very, very much promote and are asking that they are recognized verbally within churches, communities, the government, of being the original people, to not just become invisible. And studying and learning more about I used to say Lenny Lenape's too, would be very, very good. I think there's also a couple of sites where you can go on and see what particular tribe lived in any part of the country where you may have been born or whatever. So there's a whole lot of information out there. Mm-hmm. And the pride and the requirements for whether or not you can claim Native American blood, or that this is made by a Native American, now indigenous tribe, is quite strict even on a federal level. So there was an attempt to make recently to make the heritage special, but it seems to be continuing to be invisible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Lynn.
I just would say, since we're on indigenous people, the church that I grew up on is going to be celebrating its 300th anniversary in 3 years. And recently they found out that to build their church, they drove out the indigenous people in that area. So they are now reckoning, mm-hmm. for the 300th anniversary, how can we recognize and, do reparations or things to that, mm-hmm. group of people. So it's good to, look at that and see how we can do that for our certain areas.
Yeah, I think that's like Margie said, some of the history we just don't know, don't search out. Yeah, I think that would be very important. Carolyn.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, follow up what Don said. I used to say Lenape too, and I made that comment in the course of a family conversation one day, and I was immediately corrected by one of the family members who was a history teacher and a couple of the younger members of the family. And I felt really glad to know that the schools are beginning to try to correct some of the erroneous history that we were taught. And I find that very comforting. I don't know how much progress they've made with the area of racism, but at least there's a beginning, and they're identifying it and trying to make some changes, which I think we should find very comforting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Juneteenth, I'm just curious, I'm going to throw it out there. What do you think we ought to be doing as a church or as people with Juneteenth? Kathy.
I was going to ask you the same question. I was very curious about it now that I know what it is, and I didn't for many years know what it was, but I think it is important as a people of faith to acknowledge it. And I don't know if it's appropriate to celebrate it the same way, because it doesn't have the same meaning for us. But I think, like Jamar said, to acknowledge it, to celebrate it, maybe a moment of silence, maybe I don't know, some kind of announcement, some kind of children's message. I don't know what to do, but I feel like to ignore it isn't right, but to celebrate the progress, like he said. Mm-hmm. Celebrate the progress that we've made, even though realizing that we still have so far to go.
Mm-hmm. Susan. Sue Kelly. I see your hand up.
Sorry. Yeah, Kathy, the celebration of the opportunity to walk Christ's path. We studied the color of compromise and the complicity of the church. And the end of slavery was a challenge for the church, and how what grew from that in terms of our history within Protestant religion. I think is something for education and to celebrate that we understand more deeply what that meant. I would be very interested in hopefully being invited or understanding within maybe an interactive group, a diverse group, of learning more of the heart and the meaning within the community of people of color. That heart-to-heart connection and discussion could be life-changing. I think could be very. It could be based around the celebration of humanity and light coming into or beginning to glimmer in the world a little bit more brightly. Does that make sense?
Yep. I believe it was last year that Westchester made Juneteenth a holiday. Am I remembering that correctly? Do any of you remember hearing them declare that? I thought last year that I heard that they were declaring it a holiday. I'll have to do some research on that. Bob?
To my fellow clergy types here on this Zoom, and maybe Lynn as well, if you go to your Presbyterian planning calendar, there is a reference there to resources for celebrating Juneteenth.
Thank you.
I didn't pursue it. I just saw that there is a reference there.
Yeah, well, thank you. Okay. Don, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just looked it up quickly. Chester County offices will be closed June 18th, 2021 for future days in mid-June in honor of the celebration of Juneteenth. So yes, it's official.
Yeah. Paul?
If we couldn't find an appropriate speaker, that might be tough, but we could have special music, which I think the church would really appreciate. We could have, if it's only 2 months from now, maybe it's going to be early to have youth together, but youth putting together something for us would be educational for them under our leadership and would be a good way. There are just a number of things that we can do as a congregation.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are it is past, I think it's 12:45 at this point. So is there any last thought that anybody needed to share or wants to share before we wrap up for today? I really appreciate all of you contributing to the discussion and to this class. I'm just so grateful to be in a church where we can talk about this together and be studying and growing, stretching, coming to recognize some things that maybe we've been blind to in the past, and hopefully allowing Christ to lead us in those ways of laying down our lives for our one another, as Don preached in our sermon this morning. Grateful for all of you. So next week, if you're reading along, chapters 5 and 6 would be the ones to read for next week, and Don will be leading us. I don't know, Don, if you've had any chance to think about anything that you want to tell people ahead of time to be ready, or I don't want to put you on the spot.
I'm on the 23rd, not the 16th.
Oh, well, who's next week? Is it John?
I'd have to look.
All right. now I'm saying all that. Am I wrong that next week's two sessions?
Next week is 2 sessions, but it's John Frost.
All right, I had the wrong facilitator. I am sorry, Don.
The-
You're like looking at me like, what? All right, so John Frost will be facilitating, but it's still the 2 sessions, 5 and 6 for next week.
I'm preaching next Sunday and moderating a congregational meeting, so the class might be a little more than I want to take on.
You're a little busy. Yeah. All right, well, I'm gonna close this with prayer, and I want to wish all that are on that are mothers a happy Mother's Day, and hope that you're having a day that is what you want to do. So, all right, would you join your hearts with me for prayer? We thank you, Lord, for opening our hearts and our minds as Jamar is teaching us and leading us to learn more, to grow more, to stretch more as your people. We give ourselves to you in this ongoing desire to fight against racism and to do our part. Help us to find courage, help us to find humility, help us to find ways that we can take up the work that is in front of us. And we thank you for one another, that we have one another, and help us to get beyond our one another of our church and to reach into our community of one another, to be the presence of Christ, the love of Christ, and to be willing to sacrifice and lay our lives down for the sake of others in his name. We pray all of this in Jesus' name, and we give you thanks. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jenny. Happy
Thank you.
Mother's Day.
Thank you. Everybody have a good rest of your day and a good rest of your week.
Thank you, you too.